the idea for this event came from our moderator tonight, Professor Harvey Limelin. He worked with Mimi Medeiros, who was a summer intern with us. And Mimi did such a great job bringing this concept to life. Mimi is a sophomore STEM scholar at the University of Connecticut, majoring in animal science on a pre-vet track. I'm glad she's able to come. She's here right now because she was just a few minutes ago in a Wildlife Society club meeting. Thank you so much, Mimi, for everything that you did to make this event possible. I also wanted to tell you a little bit about our moderator. Dr. Limelin is a professor in the School of Outdoor Recreation, Parks, and Tourism at Lakehead University in Ontario. He has extensive experience researching a wide array of topics related to parks and protected areas, and certainly wildlife management. Harvey is a collaborative, experiential researcher working alongside and for communities, whether those communities are protected area management personnel, polar bear celebrations, or Aboriginal and First Nation communities in Canada. His latest work is some of my very favorite. It's on insect tourism. Before turning this over to Harvey, I just want to thank you again for supporting Fanimal with your presence tonight. We have a small but dedicated team, and I love them all. The mission of Fanimal is to provide a space where early career individuals and younger kids learn and explore animal-related fields. We want to foster discovery and community and accelerate career building for people who love animals, who are fans of animals. We want to multiply the impact that we have on animals by focusing on the development of animal allies, academics, advocates, and activists. I'm putting the website in the chat, so please check us out. Thank you for being here, and now I'm turning it over to Harvey.
All right, thanks, Carol. Thank you for this really lovely introduction. As it is customary in Canada, I recognize that I am presenting from the Robinson Superior Treaty Territory, the Fort William First Nations traditional lands, and also the traditional lands of the Métis Nation of Ontario. So I bid you greetings from Gitchigami, the shores of Lake Superior, and I will say it is the world's greatest lake. That's not a debate right now for this. I do really walk the talk. I have two pictures. That is a praying mantis and a jumping spider. I really love arthropods in general. I've learned a lot about wildlife photography. I first came face to face with it in Churchill, Manitoba, with all of those polar bear images. And that's where one of the ideas that came from it. So I'm going to be moderating this. I'll just go quickly over the agenda. Of course, the panelists will have an introduction. Hopefully they'll be better at it than academics are, because you're only given about a minute. And then we'll go into, we have 5 questions for 4 panelists tonight and about 12 minutes for questions. If you go under, that's fine. We are trying to keep tabs on the times, because I've dealt with enough Zoom conferences dealing with academics that they never stay on time, and Carol can attest to that. Not that she does it, but other academics have done it. And then we also want to leave plenty of time at the end of the session till about, so the questions will be from 6:50 to about 7:50, and then we're going to try to leave about 10 to 20 minutes for questions from our audience. All right, so we have 4 speakers tonight. I'm just going to introduce you by the first names. I know it's not proper, but it is an informal discussion that we're having tonight. So we have Sarah, Stephen, Tamara, and Daniel. Joshua, unless I'm wrong, RJ, Joshua could not join us tonight, correct? Okay, so we have the 4 speakers. And Sarah, you can start by introducing yourself. You got about a minute. We're supposedly have a timer on screen. I don't know if it's working. I can't see it, so.
All right, well, I probably don't need a full minute. I'm Sarah Killingsworth. I am a Northern California-based wildlife and conservation photographer and filmmaker. My area of focus is generally native predators and coexistence with predators, and my specific passion is bobcats and suburban wildlife.
Wow, that was very, very succinct. Thank you, Sarah. Stephen.
I'm Steve Bond. I am a underwater photographer with about 25 years of experience diving and taking pictures. I most of my time is spent advising dive shops and tour operations, as well as doing some private gallery work, but largely focused on protected areas. And I also am a big fan of arthropods, though I really enjoy the underwater variety.
All right, great. Tamara.
Hello, everyone. My name is Tamara Vlasquez. I'm a conservation and wildlife photographer based in Mexico City, in Mexico. Currently, I am working on developing a project for raising awareness about urban wildlife, the wildlife that resides here in Mexico City. And I also use my photography for environmental education purposes.
Okay, and last but not least, Daniel.
Hi, I'm Daniel Dietrich. I'm a wildlife and conservation photographer and filmmaker based in Northern California. I have a safari company, Point Reyes Safaris, where I take photographers out to enjoy the wildlife of Northern California. I'm also the founder of Conservation Kids, a nonprofit focused on connecting kids to the environment through photography.
Sorry about that, folks. I couldn't unmute myself. So that's fantastic. We should work with wildlife photographers who are more succinct on their introductions than any academic I've ever met, including myself. So what we're going to do now is in no particular order. If you're detecting an accent, I am French Canadian, so my accent does come out once in a while. So our first question is tonight, and we'll start with Tamara in lovely Mexico City. Name one or two instances that have transformed your wildlife photography journey.
Okay, that's a good question. I would say that the first instance was when I was working at one of the zoos here in Mexico City, where I did learn a lot about conservation biology and wildlife, especially about birds of prey. However, sadly, I also learned about all the mistreatment, exploitation, and everything that goes on behind closed doors, at least in Mexican zoos. So I think that sparked some kind of flame or something in me that made me realize that if I wanted to help wildlife with my photography, I first needed to study the ethics behind the photography, how to treat animals with respect, respecting their environment, and how to tell their stories from their point of view and not from that anthropocentric and controlling point of view that sometimes humans tend to overpower animals with.
And what drove your passion forward or helped you realize ethical behaviors or kind of drew attention to the importance of ethical behaviors in photography?
Well, I think it was thanks to many other photographers that have, I don't know, made some kind of a legacy with their work, studying what they do, listening to their TED Talks, their podcasts, and the way that they work, the way that they tell the stories in such a respectful and empathetic way towards the animals, that it actually drove me to learn more about these animals' behaviors, their habitats, their ecosystems, and so that I could also provide them with the respect and the ethical behavior that they deserved from me when I was taking their shots.
All right, thank you.
You're welcome.
Stephen, do you want to go next? Do you need me to repeat the question or?
No, it's not. I'm just looking at RJ's timer. I know he's working on that. So I think and this was not just from a photography standpoint, but from a conservation standpoint. I was working a dive boat out of the South Pacific, and noticing the changes between islands and between areas that were protected and those that were not. And the stark difference in everything from the health of the corals to the number of fish was just so absolutely incredible. And you can see this. My last trip a couple of months ago was down to Cozumel, and the same thing occurs in islands around the Caribbean and islands in the middle of the South Pacific. Is those areas that have strong protection, the reefs are much healthier. the fish are healthier, and also it is better for the local populations. And kind of the way to tell people that it's so, you can describe it as, in as flowery language as you want, but there's no way to deliver that without images, whether video or still. And that was really one of the big drivers that I wanted to show. That very thing is the value of conservation, the value of management. And one of the big drivers for me was the value of protected areas to the reefs and to our fish and our future.
So, Stephen, since you brought in protected areas, I know that Tamara also mentioned it. Does protection equal ethical behavior?
It hopefully does, but no, I mean, these are guidelines, and particularly in areas where one of the things that's always a big challenge for me is going into new areas and trying to expand protection of fisheries where you're talking about people's livelihood, and it's difficult to tell people don't feed your family. So, what is ethical behavior within is it ethical for someone to be fishing in a protected area when their family's hungry? Difficult call. So there are always challenges. So ideally, yes, but ideally you also have to give people options for this behavior and show them that it is not only the right thing to do from a wildlife perspective, but one that is the right thing to do from an economic perspective as well. And that's not very hard to see long term, but from a short term and on an individual basis, it can be a challenge.
Great, you bring in a really important component, right? We often focus on the visitors, but often the discussions regarding locals is as, if not more important. So hopefully we'll have an opportunity to address that in the follow-up questions. Sarah.
Thank
You're
you.
up next.
All right, had to unmute myself, sorry. So my wildlife photography journey really started with a passion for wildlife and actually taking my own children out to see local wildlife and taking photos and sharing them with friends and family, which prompted people to tell me that they were sharing those photos with their own children who loved them, and eventually moved me into part of what I do now, which is a program coordinator for Project Coyote as their youth education and outreach coordinator for Keeping It Wild. And so for me, it's about engendering a passion for wildlife and what wilderness areas in general in youth, and empowering them to feel like they have a say in the future and the animals that are in our wilderness areas. And then within a few years, I had a photo that went viral that I took of an animal that had been injured. And that prompted me to really try and harness the power of the images that I was taking to help educate people about some of the unfortunate things that are happening even in protected areas, and really bring a focus on having empathy for all of the animals, not just for photographers, but for visitors in general, and treating them with that respect.
Great, thank you. Daniel.
Yeah, I think a couple of things really. For me, it really does boil down to empathy. These animals don't have a voice, and it really boils down to our individual sort of empathy for these animals. My wildlife photography career got started really in the owl space. I had been seeing all these incredible images of owls and talons outstretched coming at the prey and beautiful light. And just really was just amazed at how these photographers were able to capture these majestic animals. And it wasn't too hard to find out how that was happening. A lot of these photographers were going to the pet store and buying mice and bringing them out to the field and dangling these mice in front of the owls and throwing the mice out. And these owls would swoop in and grab the mice and then fly away. And meanwhile, 10 photographers are circled around the guy who's throwing the mice out, and they'll throw mouse after mouse after mouse after mouse after mouse. And really, it's the sort of challenges within that whole sphere. There's so many sort of wrongs in that scenario. The two biggest being it's dangerous for the owl, and certainly there's no empathy at all for the mouse in that situation, a sentient being as well. And so that was really my throw into this, my aha moment of just, wow, this is how some of my heroes in the photography world are capturing some of their images. And I really sort of launched myself into the ethics from that single incident. And then moving over more into the empathy and into the conservation piece, I live in Point Reyes National Seashore, and every place has its politics. Yellowstone has its wolves and bears and bison, and Point Reyes has its own challenge here, where we have a group of private citizens that live inside our national park and operate commercial businesses. And as part of this, the National Park Service was planning on killing tule elk to assist in the expansion of the ranching inside the park. And for me, again, boiling down to empathy and conservation and what this land was for. And that really sprang me into this sort of conservation space where I've been working and trying to stop that killing of the tule elk. So really it boils down to sort of empathy for the animals that we're all saying that we love so much, and really respecting that and honoring this place with them.
Thank you, Daniel. Yeah, the whole ethical dimension and what is done behind the lenses to take a picture of the lenses, in front of the lenses. I saw the same thing in Churchill, where female polar bears, female sows, were darted and they were sleeping, and people would actually manipulate the cubs and put them on top of female, or manipulate them and then take pictures and then claim it was original and that they'd been sitting out there for a long time. I found it very disrespectful to the animal, especially since it was such in a lethargic state. So yeah, I'm aware of manipulations and baiting and all of that. I didn't know about the owls though with mice.
Yeah, and sadly it's rampant. It's all across the board with just about every species that you can think of. There's some sort of side group that's doing something to photograph that animal that would be challenging from an ethical standpoint.
Yeah, it's a very important discussion. And last but not least, Dietrich. I think we might have lost him. Okay, because I'm here. Is everybody hearing that weird sound?
The whistle, yeah.
Okay. So do you want me to move on to the next question then?
I think that works, yeah.
Okay. All right, and we can always come back to it. We do have a bit of time. All right, so question 2, and we'll start with Sarah. What is the biggest challenge? What is the biggest challenge to wildlife photography? That's a very big open-ended question.
It is a big open-ended question, but it's a really good question. And it ties into, actually, from my perspective, the ethical issues we were just talking about. So for me, I think one of the biggest challenges for wildlife photography is the amount of time that you need to invest to adequately understand and appreciate natural behaviors and to capture images that have real impact. And like most things, the greatest challenge is also the greatest gift. And that time spent in communion with wildlife, if you are willing to sit and be quiet and not disturb them, you're rewarded beyond measure. But I think a lot of the unethical practices that we've started touching on result from people not having that time or feeling like they don't have that time. And so it's a desire to take a shortcut. And so I think the time needed is a challenge also from the perspective of people who want to get that photo. They've seen it online, they've seen it on Instagram. They think they can get this amazing shot, but maybe they need to, quote unquote, cheat a little and go to a game farm where it's a captive animal in an enclosure that isn't fed until it's trotted out for photographers, which is an incredibly abhorrent practice. And there are a number of those places in the US, and I don't know about other countries, but So I would say that time is the challenge.
And the follow-up kind of sub-question is, how has COVID affected wildlife photography?
Well, there were a lot more people out taking photos. I think, COVID was interesting because I think at least here in Northern California, it was a huge increase in pressure on local areas, at least during the times where people were allowed to leave. And we had restrictions that were even county by county, like you couldn't leave your county at certain times. But I think because there were so few things people could do other than go outside for certain times, there was a lot of pressure on places like Point Reyes National Seashore and other parks. And at the same time, there was a decrease probably in all of the tourism that we also mentioned a bit ago for wildlife or photography. So I think it increased pressure in certain places and decreased it in others probably.
Okay, thank you. Tamara, you're next.
Okay, great. I have to agree with Sarah mostly on what she said. I also think that one of the biggest challenges in wildlife photography nowadays is that it has become really, really popular in most countries. And just as Sarah mentioned, this has resulted in people taking the easy way for having this amazing portrait shot, a cover shot for a magazine. And because it has become so much like a hobby, a very popular hobby nowadays, I think a lot of people are struggling to find jobs or to make their photography stand out by just following ethical practices. So everyone wants to get this one in a lifetime picture, Everyone wants to get, as Daniel was saying, the shot of the owl coming down with its talons sharp, clutching the mouse. So a lot of people are getting into much more unethical practices than before because of the high popularity that you can now see in wildlife photography. And I think it's because of social media and contests. Also, all these spaces have also made this unethical practices much more common because it's a lot of competition. I mean, you can say that you're a wildlife photographer, but just like you, there are other 50,000 wildlife photographers that want to have fame, that want to be on the spot, that want to land a job in National Geographic, for example. So I think the lack of job opportunities for photographers, especially in countries like Mexico, and the fact that there are so many photographers nowadays, has become a great challenge for ethical wildlife photography, since everyone wants to get that once in a lifetime shot and are willing to do whatever it takes.
Great. Daniel, want to go next?
On mute there, sorry. Sorry, I was muted. Yeah, it's hard to add much more than that. I mean, that is what they both said is really clear. I think, one of the challenges for the public from a wildlife photography standpoint, if we're sort of focusing on the ethics, is one of the ways that a lot of photographers are making their money are with workshops and tours. And with COVID and the explosion of wildlife photography that Tamara was talking about, there are hundreds and hundreds of guides available now that have just really surfaced in the last 3 or 4 years. And so the amount of opportunities for you to join somebody to go on an owl workshop or a wolf workshop is really overwhelming. And I would just say to everybody who's looking at hiring a guide or hiring going to a workshop, to please do your research on it, as opposed to just picking one, because all guides are not the same. And there are many guides who are unethical. And there's a lot of pressure for people to build their name. And for instance, the owl workshops, there are a lot of guides who do this with the mice, with the owls. Do your homework and make sure that you're asking other people that have gone with them and looking at website reviews and talking to photographers that have been on the workshops, and making sure that you're selecting an ethical guide who is not going to compromise the health and safety of the subjects that you're trying to photograph. That's probably the biggest challenge, I think, from the public standpoint. And then just from the professional standpoint, it is a very crowded space, and everybody's trying to find their niche. You know, when the ethics are compromised and people are cutting corners, you know, it does make it harder for ethical photographers to who are trying to put the time in and the effort to capture those images in the wild versus at these workshops. It does become tougher to make a living and generate income from that when you're competing with those types of ethical practices. But thankfully, a lot of magazines and a lot of contests. We worked very hard. I'm on the NAMPA ethics committee, and many organizations are working very hard to end these practices for use in stories and in photo contests and things like that. So hopefully, with that momentum, you know, that can continue.
Great. Perhaps one of the things we can do as a follow-up to the workshop is provide suggestions on certification that people could look for and what you were referring to, Daniel. So we know if we want to take these types of workshops that there should be some qualifications that we're looking for, people could examine. Thank you.
Yeah.
Stephen.
So first off, you know, in a lot of ways, I'm in commuting around major cities. The easing of COVID has been painful because it was so easy to get around. And the same thing was with international travel being curtailed. It was a pretty wonderful thing for a lot of reefs around the world to get respite from pressure from divers, photographers, and other tourists. So in that standpoint, the wildlife got a rest. I was fortunate enough to be able to sail down to a couple of different destinations, and it was really amazing the difference with much lower pressure on the reefs. But you know, I echo very much what everyone else was saying. It's partly the easy access to equipment. Social media has driven people to think that they're going to be able to get the images that professionals are able to get, and they will do anything to get there. It is a really difficult thing. And Sarah, as you were saying, patience is like my biggest limitation. I would love to be able to spend, 6 months in one location and just really, to get that right light, to get that right, conflagration of everything it's a really challenging thing. But when people are on vacation for a weekend or a week and they are determined to get that shot, they will do anything to get it. And it's who's there. And Daniel, as you were saying, the only people who are there, whether it's dive guides or people running tours or otherwise, that's our control. And getting ethical guidelines for those people is hugely important. And we can set as many rules as we like. We can work with local governments to do so, but the fact is the policing is going to be done by the people in the wild. So that can be a challenging thing.
Some great points there. Also, that it's easier for management agencies to remove an animal than it is for them to pursue somebody and charge them through the courts, especially if they're not local individuals, they're international visitors. So unfortunately, it's often the animals that pay the price, even though that they were conditioned or food conditioned to do this. So yeah, there's some big ethical challenges. All right, thank you, everyone. So we're moving on to question 3, and we'll start with Daniel. I'm trying to provide everybody with, I guess it doesn't really matter with Zoom first response, but I'm just trying to move everybody around here. So how are the North American Nature Photography, how has the North American Nature Photography Association's principles of ethical field practices, truth in captioning, statesman integrated in your wildlife photography? And we'll start with Dan.
Sure. Well, I helped draft a lot of those, so it's pretty much right in line with what I practice out in the field. So yeah, I mean, again, not to repeat myself, but it really does boil down to empathy for the animals. What are you doing to ensure that your presence has the minimal effect on the subjects that you're shooting? And I think that's what it boils down to for me. You know, I'm a wildlife guide, and I do feel the pressure to help my guests get shots. And so we have to make decisions regardless if we're guides or if we're tourists, to ensure that our presence has minimal impact on the animals as possible. And so that's, you know, all the sort of guidelines and the suggestions around all the things that all the different groups that are talking about ethics really surround. Things like truth and captioning, you know, that definitely boils down to an ethical choice as well. You know, like you were saying, where people are manipulating animals and putting cubs on backs and moving insects and toads onto mushrooms and hanging frogs on lines and killing deer to bring in wolves. There's you know, like Sarah mentioned, shooting animals at game farms where the animals are not fed and brought out like circus animals to perform for treats. So, you know, we make some choices on how and where we're gonna photograph these animals. And if we do take a picture of an animal at a accredited zoo or a wild rehab place, that we say so, that we tell our fans and the public that this was a controlled situation. And I got this wonderful picture of this snow leopard here at this animal facility, and not pretending that you were off in the mountains of Tibet and selling photos to fans who think that you captured these things in the wild. So being empathetic and being truthful are really the guidelines for all the suggestions for all these organizations.
Okay, and in fairness to you, Daniel, there was one third point that I didn't. Please discuss, if you want, the roles of social media and wildlife photography.
Yeah, you know, social media is a really powerful and positive and challenging thing for wildlife. You know, we've all said it, even here today. You know, somebody gets a shot of some magnificent creature, and you know, hundreds of thousands, millions of people see this image, and a percentage of them want that same image, or they want to go to that place. So you know, along with sharing these wonderful images with fans and followers, comes the responsibility of ensuring that that your posts are truthful, and that we're not sharing locations of really sensitive animals or nest sites or den sites with the general public. You know, thinking about our captioning when we're posting these wonderful pictures on social media is really important, to make sure that we have the best interests of the animal in mind.
Great, thank you. Stephen.
So can you repeat the question? I was so ensconced in his answer.
Okay, so I'm just gonna, how are the NAMPA principles, such as ethical field practices, truth and captioning statements, integrated in your wildlife photography? And then there's a couple of smaller questions here. Can you expand on the principles of ethical field practices? Can you discuss the importance of truth and captioning statements? And please discuss the role of social media and wildlife photography. If you need me to repeat any of these questions, I'll gladly do so.
No, I appreciate that very much. So in terms of, you know, I before this call, I wasn't familiar with these specifically by the organization name, but these are the practices I've been teaching to the groups that I work with. You know, you look at ethical field practices, that's just how else can you approach and protect an area properly without these very things? So the feeding, the baiting, that sort of thing. Also approaching, how you approach and treat animals in marine environments, especially teaching dive shops practices where they're in extremely fragile environments. So how do you, what are the rules? How do you instruct folks to best approach? Well, it's you can't touch anything. You can't touch anything. You can't approach any of the animals, let them come to you. You can't feed them. These are all things that are, table stakes for for what I'm teaching and the practices I'm putting into place at organizations. With regard to truth in captioning, and I look at a lot of the images that I come across and compete against. There's a level of art photography, image manipulation, where you're not even you're dealing with painting as opposed to photography, and it's a couple of different things. It can get frustrating seeing some of the work out there, but it's a lot of self-policing and honesty out there, and it can be frustrating as a professional doing this, but at the same time you can only control your own standards. So the social media thing, I think we've kind of, all of us have touched on it, is the wanting that perfect shot, going to any means and being driven by a market which is kind of taking an unrealistic approach to what people expect to get. And they're viewing from professionals who have been out in the field days, weeks, or months to get these pictures and want to get them at a weekend and have those expectations. So kind of toning down some of those expectations is something that we try to do during our workshops to control people's expectations and the associated behaviors.
Great, thank you. Sarah.
Thanks. So I'm also on the NAMPA Ethics Committee, and I think everyone's touched on the idea of having empathy for the wildlife that we are out there trying to photograph. And I think the thing that's most important, first and foremost in the field, is to keep the well-being of the animal itself ahead of any particular image or shot that you might have in mind. And one of the things that that means is understanding what natural behavior would be and what a sign of stress looks like in that animal, because some animals that are stressed might run away and use valuable energy that they need for feeding themselves or their young or surviving. But some animals, when they're stressed, will lay flat and close their eyes. And if you don't know that that's a sign of stress in the animal, you might think they're just taking a nap. And so it's really important in terms of ethical field practices to understand what signs of stress are and to back away if you see them. In terms of the truth in captioning, I, on my images, always say that the animals are wild, never baited, and not called in. And I think one of the ways to educate people, because I'm amazed how many people just don't know that there are unethical practices at all in wildlife photography. And frankly, when I started out, I didn't have any idea that people baited owls, because I got into photography because I liked watching the natural behavior. It never occurred to me to try and manipulate that behavior, but lots of people do. And so by including truth in your captioning, you're calling attention to the fact that there are different ways of obtaining the images. And I think that's really important. One thing about social media, I think the ills of posting locations, increasing pressure, those have been well covered. But I will say that the flip side of that is that social media can be a powerful tool for conservation and for bringing attention to a particular issue or species or cause. And so like anything else, it can be used for good or evil, so to speak. And I would love to see more of the social media emphasis on conservation and preservation and reaching new people for areas of concern versus the everyone's out there trying to get that last shot.
There, I did it just like everybody else goes. One of the things that I have found out working with arthropods is how some photographers will actually put them in the fridge. Sorry, it's not very funny, but manipulate them and slow them down quite a bit, and then bring them out and into a natural environment and then say it was a natural shot. So there's various dimensions to whatever we want to call manipulation, right? But I was not aware of that, but I shouldn't be surprised anymore, but I still sometimes am surprised. So the manipulation can go many, many different ways. Thank you for that. And Tamara.
Thanks. Yeah, I agree with you about the manipulation of the animals. I think that's a very important thing that we need to discuss, because I don't know if it's the same in the US or in Canada, but here in Mexico, a lot of the wildlife photographers, conservation photographers are also biologists or some kind of scientists. So they also tend to run workshops, photo trips, safaris, the works. But many of the scientists sadly do engage in these unethical practices, especially on the baiting and the manipulating of the animals. Some even use captive animals in wild spaces in order to provide their guests and their friends with this kind of amazing shot and, you know, once in a lifetime experience. And sadly, I think this actually makes people, you know, the regular people that maybe their followers or somebody else believe that this is okay, because this is a scientist doing these things. And as a scientist, you hold a certain authority over wildlife, over conservation, and over people, so to speak. So they're setting a terrible example. And this kind of issues, at least here in Mexico, are not being discussed enough. And it is very important to note that precisely manipulating animals, baiting them, staging the shot in any way is unethical. It's damaging the animals. It's lacking empathy. And it is going to make people believe that it's okay to do this. And imagine if you have 100,000 people replicating all these practices, then conservation photography or wildlife photography is not going to help wildlife or conservation anymore. So I think it's a very serious issue that we need to address constantly in order to educate people, because as everyone was saying, sometimes people don't know anything about this. And I think educating them is a great tool for us to diminish all these unethical practices. And I think that's where social media comes in. Just like Sarah was talking about, that social media can be an excellent tool, not just for wildlife conservation, but also for educating the people. And this comes also with the truthful captioning and the truthful editing of your shots. If you point out all these kinds of things in your Instagram posts or in your video, your YouTube video, your TikTok, whatever platform you're using, it's going to be easier for you to reach people and educate them into the ethical practices regarding wildlife and conservation photography. And it's going to be easier for all of us to put an end to all these unethical practices. So I think it's very important to always state in your caption, as Daniel, Sarah, and Stephen were saying, that where this shot was taken, if the animal was wild or if it was taken at a zoo, what kind of editing did you do, if you manipulated the shot in Lightroom or Photoshop quite a bit, or if you just manipulated the contrast. I have to admit that sometimes I like to play around a little bit more with my shots. You know, I try to edit them as truthful as possible, but sometimes the little artist in me takes over, and you know, but you say that, you write that in your caption so that people know that that shot was manipulated and that's not the real thing. They are not going to go into the forest and find a very yellow butterfly flying around, you know, so to speak. So very important to say all these things, to be honest, because it also helps you build your reputation as an ethical and honest photographer. And that also looks good in a professional way. But for me, I think all this, the main objective of using social media is to educate people, both regarding to the environment and how they can contribute to conservation, but also how they can be better and much more ethical photographers.
Great, thank you, everyone. So in our last question, what is ethical photography in wildlife tourism? Now, I know that everyone has mentioned components of it, but you now have time to kind of give examples how it's been applied in tourism, perhaps in your own practices, perhaps in your own guided outings, and just how, if you can provide a specific example of how it's been used, that would be greatly appreciated. And we'll start with Sarah.
Okay, thank you. So I think ethical tourism, wildlife tourism, is again really focused on the well-being of the wildlife and the local community where it is being photographed. And so I think Stephen mentioned earlier, we're not just talking about the visitors, we're also talking about the local community. And conservation efforts are only really going to be long-term successful if they incorporate the needs of the local community and population and address those and bring them into the conversation. In an ideal world, they're leading that conversation and they're being supported by wildlife tourism. So I would say that the wildlife tourism, the ethical treatment is really about doing your homework before you go somewhere and finding out, where you're going and sort of what conditions, if you're looking for, wildlife photography, what conditions the animals are kept in, if they're wild or captive. It's learning more about your tour leader or the group that you're going with. Some groups have built their reputation on doing ethical trips that are wild animals in natural habitats, natural behavior, not manipulated. And so finding people who've been on the trips, looking up reviews online, talking to other photographers about people they know who are ethical. There's a lot of different ways to find out, but ideally the group or the person that you go with would be committed not only to the well-being of the wildlife, but also to the well-being of that community and help support local businesses and people who are doing ethical things, because there can actually be a lot of money and therefore benefit to a local community in wildlife tourism if it's done well. And so that can help counteract some of the economic pressures that sometimes are present that may make at times what feels like a challenge for conservation. The best practices I've seen, when I went to Churchill to photograph polar bears a couple of years ago, I went with a US tour company, but they had built a relationship with a local research center and were supporting them in a variety of ways in addition to doing tours up there. And we're very, very mindful of the activities that we engage in. And I assure you, nobody moved any polar bear cubs while I was up there in that group. I'm shocked that anybody does that. But yeah, I think, it's about doing your homework and knowing who you're going with and researching the area you're going and making sure that the well-being of the wildlife comes first.
Well, it makes me really smile to hear what you're talking about, Sarah, because I was at Churchill Northern Study Center, a place that I was a director from and actually did my PhD out of. So I'm quite aware of that center. So yes, the walking the walk and talking the talk, the study center is still occurring. So that's fantastic. Tamara, you're next.
All right. Okay, great. So yeah, I agree with Sarah in everything that she said. It's very important to do your homework and know who are you taking a wildlife tour with. What are their practices? Just as Daniel mentioned, if the guide is going to be throwing mice at the owl, then don't buy a tour with them. You have to really educate yourself on what is ethical wildlife photography and tourism so that you don't fall in the hands of these kind of groups and you don't end up regretting your trip, because it could be a great experience and it can totally get ruined because of such an experience. Also, I think that a great way to apply ethical wildlife photography to tourism is going to areas where, for example, here in Mexico City, there's a natural area called Xochimilco, which is a wetland. It's to the south of the city and it's really threatened by urbanization and by illegal mega projects, the building of malls and everything. But it is normally known to people as this place where you can go and drink with your friends and party over the water, sailing on small boats. But people do not know that it's actually a natural protected reserve, a place where endangered species live, where migratory birds come every single winter. So what I have been doing is organizing tours to the non-touristic part of the area and not just give my guests, tips on photography, but also talk to them about what is going on, about conservation, educating them a little bit how they can help. And I think that's a great way to apply your photography knowledge to conservation also, because you are also going to inspire people to take care of this place where they can take amazing shots, but they can also get involved into helping the local community there, just as Sarah was telling, and the local ecosystem without even getting out of the city. So I think, again, education is the best tool for ensuring that wildlife tourism and wildlife photography remains ethical.
Great, fantastic. And two of the most amazing things I've seen in Mexico are the firefly sanctuaries and of course the monarch butterfly
Right.
aggregations.
It's wonderful. Yeah.
And what's fantastic with the monarch aggregations is when you can hear what a million wings sound like of butterflies. So they actually do make a sound. So yes, and of course you talk to local people, so it's very important with that. And yes, I've been to the wetlands too, and I did chase a couple of dragonflies trying to identify them. So
Wonderful.
all right, our next, Stephen, you're next.
So once again, I absolutely concur with earlier statements. The one thing that that I always think about is not leaving things as good as you left them, but making them better. And when we look at some of the changes that have happened, particularly in the marine environments, the days of of captive dolphins and seals, those are done. We're watching those, and that's largely driven by the media around them, by pictures of them, by understanding deeper what is happening, to the specific wildlife. And I think the same, by extension, we can do, have the same perspective with what is happening with overdevelopment to, protected areas of both terrestrial and marine, and getting that message out, not only using photography and tourism as a tool to, to educate, to inform, but as a way to facilitate progress. And that's sort of where I really, try to focus a lot of my energy, is how do we make this better for the place? And, and certainly part of that, a big part of it is for me, making sure that the local population has food sources available to them and is a player in development of those, because without those, that's just, it can happen, it can improve, but you're squeezing a balloon that's going to shift that demand elsewhere, and it doesn't always work well. So I really look at tourism and the photography as a really amazing way to get these messages across, that in a way to tell stories that you can write 10,000 words, but one picture is worth more than them.
Thank you, Stephen. And it's really important to continue to emphasize local discussion, right? In the 1930s, both the US and Canada, I'm not making this up, used to drop bombs on beluga whales, because beluga whales were seen as having an impact on our fish species. That's no longer a practice use here because of wildlife photography and nature conservation, and beluga whales are endangered, unfortunately, in the St. Lawrence. And anybody doing that would probably be taken care of. So the philosophies, what I'm trying to say is philosophies can change, and the photography can help to trigger these things and bringing these images to individuals. It's the same thing with polar bears in Churchill. At one time they were shot and no one talked about it. And the joke is now that no one is allowed to touch polar bears, period. So the philosophies can change, but locals need to be involved and see some benefits from these activities, because if they don't, then it can have some negative ramifications. Daniel.
Thanks. Yeah, going last, you get to just agree with everybody, and there's not much more I can say. That all of those statements are really important, and echoing, doing your research on your guide. I think the one thing I can add is, wildlife tourism is not just about guides as well. It's about your own individual choices when you go to a new place. So think about your own personal ethics, just like you would think about the ethics of a group that you're going with, or the people that you're deciding to go with, and make those decisions for yourself. What is ethical and not? Ethics is a challenging topic, because it goes from stay at home and never leave your house because you might step on an ant, and feeding mice to owls, right? And then there's this big area in between where, what are the different sort of levels in the ethics? And, just for example, using bird calls, right? So you're not staying home, you're not throwing a mouse to an owl, but where is the using bird calls in the sort of ethical bladder here? And that's a personal choice that you have to make. I personally don't use them because I find them disruptive to the bird. But if you are going to use them, what are the ethics around that? Are you calling a mother off a nest and a raven goes in and steals a baby or breaks an egg? Or are you constantly calling a male rival out from the bushes to challenge? How often are you using it? What time of the year are you using it? What time of the day are you using it? So, there's choices that you get to make in this area between 0 and 100, and think about the consequences of some of those things and make a decision for yourself. What is the most ethical and what is the most critical components of those choices for the actual wildlife that we're trying to feed.
Thank you. And the degrees, that great discussion that we're talking about changes, because as an environmental educator, I deal with that too, right? It's very clear that you don't feed black bears for various reasons, but I've actually had to have discussions with students going, probably the most destructive force is feeding a red squirrel, because it will, once you fed them, they will go into your backpack and eat through it to find food. So what people would never see equate the discussion on that. So having those discussions is really important, because the transformation of that behavior is very, very challenging. So thank you, everyone. So we're at the first.
So Reynold, let me ask a question, if I may, please. I'm the proud dad of Sarah Killingsworth, but I have a long history of asking the question, follow the money. If you want to stop something or start something, follow the money. So where is the money coming from to support unethical photographs? To me, that seems to be a key of addressing this issue, because if you can stop the money, you can stop the photographs. Who is buying unethical photographs? Over.
I'll leave that up to the panel. And you can also say, are they aware that they're buying unethical photographs? So probably one of the toughest questions right off the bat, but who would like to take a first stab at it from the panel?
And you're welcome for the hard question.
I can make one comment on it. There is some truth to that. There are magazines, there are TV shows, there are periodicals, there are plenty of places that pay for images and that buy unethical images. There's stock agencies that house them. So I think it boils down to, again, if you're going to look at it from the follow the money standpoint, looking at those magazines, and if you're seeing unethically sourced images, then putting your money where your mouth is, and maybe you don't buy that magazine or that periodical or follow that photographer anymore. But I do think that this it's not, while that comment is very true, follow the money. The ethics of wildlife photography is not. It can be very personal as well, and so individuals are making these choices to go out and to capture these images, and there's no money behind it necessarily. It's a personal desire to have that photo of that owl with the talons coming in and grabbing the mouse. It's a personal choice. Maybe it's likes or it's followers or social media sort of savviness, but so it's not always about the money, and it is about some individual choices as well. But yeah, Mr. Killingsworth, that is for sure a valid point when you're asking who's buying it, because there are people that are buying it, there are people that are selling it, and it's pretty easy to follow that money if you really wanted to spend a little time on it.
I would just chime in. I mean, I agree with everything Daniel just said. I really think a lot of people don't know that that's what they're buying or using. And so some of it is an education issue, and we've touched on that. Some of it is a cost issue. And, if it's a stock agency, they may have a ton of photos that are relatively inexpensive for somebody to pick up, because the shortcuts are probably cheaper, perhaps, to buy than the more ethical wildlife photos, maybe. And I want to agree with the second point. For a lot of people, this isn't about the money. For the photographers, the unethical practices aren't about the money. It's about the ego and getting the shot that they put on, whether it's Instagram or somewhere else. And so they may or may not ever monetize it, but money is not the only motivating factor for people engaging in these practices.
I have to agree with both Sarah and Daniel also, especially with Sarah's point about the ego and the fame, especially when it comes to some contests that are not very ethical, you know, maybe not the biggest contest, but maybe some local contests in some countries, you know, where local photographers want to gain all this fame, all this ego, the likes on social media. So they are willing to go to whatever it takes to get the shot in order to get all this fame. So yeah, it's not always about the money, but it's a personal choice, just like Daniel said, and just like Sarah said about ego. Yeah.
Stephen? Do you want to add anything, or are you good?
No, I don't have a whole lot to go there. I mean, it's the follow the money question really. I think they've covered it in a large way.
I think it's also, we shouldn't displace all of the responsibilities on wildlife photographers. I think that as consumers, we also make those choices to buy that wildlife photography. And we also need to educate ourselves, which is one of the outcomes of this panel, but also make and be willing to ask those questions of wildlife photographers and how those shots were taken. I know my own personal experiences where photographers followed researchers to take pictures of rare endangered gyrfalcons in Churchill, and I had to kick him out of the study center because they were interfering with research. Also, not being willing to ask difficult questions as consumers. All right. Anybody else? We actually have quite a bit of time for questions from our audience. Anyone?
Yeah, we have a few questions that were sent ahead of time. I can go for it now if you'd like. This question was from Mark, and a couple of his questions I think you answered. So this is the one I think is quite interesting is, he asked, what do you think about motion sensing photographic methods with rare animals, for example, such as snow leopards? And we wouldn't get many pictures of them without it. So is there such thing as animal privacy?
Well,
I think it's, go ahead,
Okay.
Tamara.
Thank
No,
you,
go ahead.
Daniel. Thank you. I actually enjoy taking some shots with motion sensors. I'm not that experienced. I'm starting with it, but sure, there is animal privacy, and again, it comes down to empathy. Once again, you know, maybe you are not going to put up the camera trap inside a den, but maybe you are going to put it near a water hole or a feeding ground. So you are kind of invading their privacy, but not their intimacy. You know, all this, the situations do vary a little. And also we have to be aware that without some of these images or footage, we wouldn't know much about these species that are so elusive, so hard to track, so hard to get on film or on a picture without motion sensor, without infrared sensors and camera traps. So I actually believe camera trapping is much less invasive towards the animals and their ecosystems than you being there in a hide or in a tent, you know, for weeks in a row photographing the animal, because you being there, you are going to create an impact in their ecosystem. You are going to leave out your smells, your waste, everything. But when you put on a camera trap, it's just the camera, it's a little device, you know, it's not that invasive, and the animals get used to it. So you are going to get all these intimate shots of them, all these wonderful images that are going to teach us a lot about what they are going through, the threats that they are perceiving, and how we can actually help them without being there and creating so much impact. So I think it's one of the best tools for a wildlife photographer nowadays. but also you have to be very empathetic and very careful. For example, last year I set up a camera trap in my garden to photograph a ring-tailed cat here in Mexico City. This animal is really rare in the city, very elusive, and it only comes out at night because it's nocturnal. So in order to get an amazing shot, I needed to put up flashes, you know, all these kinds of torches and artificial light to get the animal. But since I was taking the shot at an urban environment, if the flash, got activated, the light scared the animal, and there was a risk for this animal to run towards the street and get run over. So I had to make the choice of maybe getting a different kind of shot without using any kind of artificial lighting or any other thing that would scare them off, and maybe play with silhouettes or get a more artistic shot, you know. So it's a great way to get amazing shots, but also you have to be very empathetic and know about the behavior of the animal at least a little bit to see if it's going to work with them or if it's not going to work with them, and what adjustments you need to make to get your shot so that you don't harm the animal or cause any kind of negative impact.
I think well said, perfectly said. And just to reiterate that, like what Sarah was saying earlier in the conversation, really understanding the species that you're targeting. Some animals don't even look at the cameras when you go by, and others, you have an owl that's out and you flash it with its pupils wide open and you blast it with a flash, that can be more harmful. So certainly understanding the animal's behaviors and what the impact of those remote cameras are. But in general, yes, they are a wonderful way to be less disruptive. I do have one quick story on that. I had a camera out once, and I sat several hundred yards away, maybe even farther, 500 yards away, with my binoculars to watch the scene. And the animal came around the corner and went straight to my camera. So it was a great behavior for me to understand that even though I thought putting my camera hidden in the moss and the grass and it sticks around it, the animal came around and went straight to it. They smelled my feet. They smelled where I was touching the moss and the trees. So even though we do have this wonderful technology, there are still impacts. So just really understanding the full scope of what we're trying to do out there is really important.
Can I say something or a little story? I was telling somebody, Carol, about this. I had a barred owl live in my backyard for years. He would sit on the same branch, and every year between like September through like March or April, he would come the same time every day, leave the same time every day. And he was very used to us being in the backyard because we have a very small backyard. So, you know, he did become kind of a local legend. And I was able to take a lot of photographs of him because he was used to me. You know, he didn't even budge, and sometimes he'd almost even pose for me. But I'd have to be careful because I had all these people that would want to come and take photos of him. And, you know, there were a few times where I felt that he was too stressed and he would fly away. And so you have to be really careful with that. You know, I felt really bad when that would happen, but I have hundreds of photos of him. And sometimes I would do it from inside the house. So, you know, just because, you know, but he would pose. It was amazing. He was an amazing creature and I miss him.
Right. Anybody else on the panel want to comment on this question, or should we move on to the next one? RJ, do we have more questions from the audience?
Yeah, Jacqueline asked a question. It's in the chat here. So Jacqueline is an urban animal photographer, and she's wondering, she does a lot of things with animals who are feeding on discarded food. And she was wondering how to be ethical about taking photography of urban animals without creating images that support the feeding of wildlife or condone throwing out food for scavenger consumption. And where's the line drawn between photos in the bird feeder or photos of animals that have thriving on like food waste?
So that's a really interesting and good question. And I mean, part of my answer would be that it depends on the context of the image and what's being captured in the photograph. Because I think if you're just photographing those animals without the waste, without the urban environment, without possibly negative human interactions that go with it, then you are, even though you're not feeding, you're taking images that should be stated as being obtained from the animals or scavenging on human waste. But it's actually a great opportunity for a story to talk about the negative impact. And I don't know from this question what the animals are, the scavengers, but it's sort of whatever they are, likely multiple levels of negative impacts from seeking food from human sources. And common impacts would be road strikes, increased risk of death on the roads, but also increased conflict with humans and potentially their pets. So domestic cats and dogs and things like that. And so from a story perspective, it would seem to me that images of humans discarding the trash and the animals with the food or trash, and then also potentially images of whether it's injured animals or animals in a rehab facility that were injured, but it's the greater context of that. I don't think the photographing of those animals per se is unethical, but I would say it's an opportunity to talk about why that particular human behavior isn't in the interest of coexistence with wildlife generally.
Anyone else from the panel?
Yeah, I think Sarah summed that up really well, that it really is an opportunity and boils down to truth in captioning as well, and what you're using that image for. So just wanted to address the bird feeder question that she had as well. You know, bird feeders are another one of those challenging topics in the ethical community. You know, we've got our 100 scale here, and where does bird feeders fall in along with the bird calls and other things. So you know, if you have a Cooper's hawk that comes down and hunts your sparrows every time you put feed in your bird feeder, then perhaps there's an ethical decision you can choose there. Some people just put bird feeders out and never clean them, and they're a recipe for disaster with diseases that they can spread. So if you are going to feed birds with a bird feeder, you know, there are some responsibilities that come with it, and then choosing your sort of place in that decision making as to how to best ensure that the wildlife is your primary focus there, and making those ethical choices around bird feeders.
Great. Anyone else want to answer this question, or should we move on to another one? Okay. RJ, do we have another question?
Yeah, Nicholas asked a question, and feel free to verbally ask your question if you'd like as well, y'all. So Nicholas asked if any of you all had a story of when you felt in danger while attempting to take a photo, and what to do if this happens.
I can think of one where we were shooting a cuttlefish that was underneath a small rock ledge in a little kind of cutout. It was like a little amphitheater looking area, and my dive partner tapped 3 times on his tank and gave me the sign of, you know, cut off your air. I'm like, what? He shows me, and we were being circled by about a 16-foot tiger shark. So that was the most frightened I'd ever been underwater. So that was so we descended to the bottom and laid down next to a rock with our air shut off to not, that's something that's triggering to them for about, I guessed it was about 5 minutes, and it ended up being about 45 seconds. But you know, those times go slowly. But that was the probably the most scared I've ever been. But that was we were holding cameras, so, and we're trying to get a good shot, and we ended up he ended up going away, and we ended up getting a couple good pictures of a lovely little cuttlefish.
I had one one particularly scary moment several years ago in Yellowstone. Massive snowfall, and these bison were laying down on the ground, and they had a half a foot of snow on top of their heads, and it was just this magical sort of scene of all these bison just laying on the ground with all the snow sort of up on their heads. And they were a couple 100 yards out, and I had gotten out and sort of walked the tree line up to a really safe distance, and I was shooting the bison, and I just heard this freight train of sticks breaking behind me, and I looked up the hill, and a grizzly bear was charging down the hill at me. And so needless to say, I had to change my underwear when I got back to the car, but I stood up, and the bear stopped, and I just backed up, and I was just saying, "I see you, Mama, I see you," and I backed away. And then what was one of the most beautiful moments I've ever seen, 3 baby cubs came running down, and they started walking around her feet, and she was up, and her hackle was up, and the babies were all standing up, and it was a truly scary moment. But I just sort of didn't run. I just kept my head down and just sort of backed up and just said, I see you, and I just sort of backtracked and walked back to my car, and she followed me for about 100 yards all the way back to my car. So look around when you're walking, and making sure that you're in a nice, safe environment, and making sure sort of what some of the right things to do if you do encounter an animal like that.
I just wanted to chime in with a comment about sort of how you approach wildlife. I think I get asked a lot, because I shoot native predators, I get asked a lot if I'm afraid. And I've never been afraid shooting bobcats or coyotes or foxes or even bears. I will tell you that polar bears make it really clear where you are on the food chain. And so knowing what you're shooting and what safe practices are is really, really important. But I do think that animals sense your energy, and there's a way of being really present and being really respectful. If you've ever read the book, What the Robin Knows, it's a great book, but it talks about how to enter wild spaces without, our presence is a disruption no matter what, but there are ways to minimize that disruption. And I do think that when it comes to being perceived as a threat, there's a lot of things you can do in a situation with wildlife to really, as I say, I always like to hope that the animal will think that I'm just a rock in the field, right? Because I always get low and sit quiet, and I'm just as boring as the rock they walk by, and I don't influence their behavior one way or the other. So.
Great. Thank you. I think we have time for maybe 1 or 2 more questions, RJ, or if somebody from the audience just wants to ask a question.
Yeah. Anybody else have a question?
It looks like there's one in the chat that just came up.
Yeah, Jerry is asking a question. So he had an experience where he learned about ethics through wildlife photographer Melissa Grew, and calling out other popular wildlife photographers for baiting via social media. So what are other ways to normalize ethical behavior in wildlife photography?
Well, I think that other ways, just as we discussed, comes down to the captioning and how you portray your own work. You can inspire people to be much more ethical. You can educate people, the way you also talk, not just to people in social media, but to regular media. If for some reason you get interviewed, or for example, I'm also an activist, so the way that you talk to people about what's going on, a situation, and how you relate to wildlife and the environment, I think that's a great way to normalize what you should do and what you shouldn't do. And also, just like Melissa Grew did that time, I saw the event that happened that time, is calling out other photographers, because maybe for some people that doesn't seem very professional, but I think it's the other way around. As photographers, conservationists, we need to protect animals, and we need to protect what we do. So it's very important to call out the people that are not doing the right thing. So I think that's also a great way to normalize ethical behavior.
Anyone else? It's certainly calling out, other people is certainly calling out, it's happening in research circles, whether it's wildlife research or community research with Indigenous people. So it is happening.
Yeah, I think doing some research for this panel, I found a lot of wildlife photographers doing things that maybe would be considered unethical, and people commenting on that and explaining the ethics of that, and then people kind of learning from that. So I think obviously we live in a society that is very, it's become a lot more woke, as we say, and you're able to educate in a hopefully tactful way that can change people's minds about those things, for sure. I have one question if no one else has anything. And it kind of revolves around like live streaming of animals. So I live in Melbourne, Australia, and there is a nest of peregrine falcons, a family of peregrine falcons that lives in the city. And so there's a constant live stream recording of them online. And it recently gave birth to a few chicks. So just kind of wondering how you all see that in an ethical sense, or how it can be used to educate others about certain animals. Yeah.
I'll start.
Go ahead, Sarah.
No, Daniel, go ahead. I think, going back to what we talked about with camera traps, I mean, some of it does depend on the placement of the camera and the intrusion into something like a nest. I mean, nests and dens are incredibly sensitive areas to be photographing. But that said, if we protect what we love, one of the ways to help people love wild animals and wild places is to show them. And if a picture is worth 1,000 words, maybe a video is worth 1,000,000. I mean, sometimes watching that interaction and that behavior can really spark something for somebody to get more involved. So I actually think that especially the urban wildlife cameras where the animals are in skyscrapers and university dormitory buildings and all those other things, it's like the birds are surrounded by people and noise and traffic. And, these are not, probably those cameras are not particularly disruptive, assuming they're not placed too close, to the nest site. So I actually think that from an educational outreach standpoint, they're pretty wonderful. And they allow people to see things that they might not be able to see personally, either due to physical limitations or geography or otherwise. So I think they're great.
Daniel, did you have something to add?
Yeah, pretty much exactly the same. I think, again, it boils down to the species, and it boils down to the ethics of sort of setting up those cameras and nests. But Sarah nailed it. It's a great opportunity, and it really allows us to educate people on a specific species, for sure.
Great. Unless there's Stephen.
Oh, no, I was just going to answer Danya's question because I liked it. So she asked, what is your favorite animal or location to photograph? And my favorite thing in the world to do is to go out at night, go down to about 100 feet underwater and lay on the sand in the pitch darkness. The only thing you can see a little bit of moonlight and occasional stars. And take pictures of octopus crawling across the sand. So quiet, and that's my favorite. Edge of the sand by the reef, so I can see things coming out. But you see sparkles of light coming off the octopus, and I'll take flash photos of them as they crawl across the bottom, and it's damn beautiful. I wish I was there now, although this is pretty good.
All right, I want to give. Let's ask the rest of the panel. What is your favorite animal or your favorite situation to photograph? And you got about 40 seconds each. Who wants to go next?
For me, it's probably the Wildcats, more specifically the Bobcats. And I think I'm stealing Sarah's thunder because that's probably one of her favorite animals. We live in the same area. But there's something about the power and the sort of posture of a bobcat, while at the same time being very shy and elusive. It's truly an incredible animal. Coyotes are up there for me as well. So bobcats and coyotes are probably two of my favorites.
Sarah.
Yeah, so it's sort of hard to pick a location, but it's not hard to pick a species. It would indeed be bobcats, Daniel's right, and probably closely followed by gray foxes and coyotes. So bobcats have a remarkable grace, and their patience exceeds almost any other wild animal I've had the privilege of watching in terms of how long they will sit and watch. It's something I can aspire to, that level of patience. But they're beautiful animals, and watching a mother with her kittens and that bond and that connection is one of the greatest privileges I've had as a wildlife photographer.
And Tamara.
For me, it would be the sunrise at Xochimilco in Mexico City. It's a marvelous place. You know, it has such mystic essence to it with the volcanoes in the background. And especially during the winter where there is this mist, really thick mist that colors the whole scenery with yellows and oranges while the sun is coming up. And the migratory birds like pelicans, herons, and many other species start to wake up. You know, they start to stretch their wings and they take their first morning flights. I think that's wonderful. For me, that's my favorite place in the world.
Fantastic. And I want to thank everybody. We're a bit over time.